You know that feeling when you're in an argument and it's like you and the other person are speaking completely different languages. You're using the same word, sure, but you're just not connecting. It really feels like you're living in two totally separate realities. It's an incredibly frustrating experience, and I think we've all been there.
So, what's the deal? Why does this happen? Well, today we're going to dive into one very controversial framework that tries to answer that exact question. It's called the levels of awareness. And look, we're not presenting this as some kind of hard science. It's better to think of it as a unique and kind of provocative filter for understanding communication, one that's taken on a really strange life of its own online.
And that really is the key, right from its creator, Scott Adams. He basically says, don't get hung up on whether this is objectively true or false. The only thing you should be asking yourself is this mental model useful for getting around in the world? So, with that in mind, let's jump in and explore it.
All right, so here it is. This is the heart of the model. It breaks down awareness into 6 different levels, kind of like rungs on a ladder you can climb. We're going to start our journey way down at the bottom with the innocent and see what it takes to climb all the way to the top, to the author. Think of this as our map for the explainer.
So these first few rungs on the ladder, they're all defined by one thing: how a person relates to what they see as external truth and authority. It really all comes down to what you believe and who you believe. At the very bottom, you've got the innocent. Think about it. This is basically all of us when we're kids. You believe what your parents tell you, what your teachers tell you, what the experts on the news say. You believe in Santa Claus, right? You just trust the established authorities, no questions asked.
Okay, so the first step up that ladder is to the truther. This is that moment you realize, wait a second, authorities can be wrong. Sometimes they even lie to you. The whole Santa Claus illusion just shatters. And so, you start thinking that finding the real facts, the objective capital T truth, is the most important thing in the universe. Okay, hold on a second. You're probably thinking, wait a minute. Chasing the truth, that sounds like a good thing. How on earth is that a low level of awareness? And this is where the framework starts to get really counterintuitive and pretty interesting.
Well, here's the twist, according to this model. The second you decide that truth is your #1 priority, you actually open yourself up to being manipulated. Why? Because you can't possibly know all the facts about the world directly. You have to get them from somewhere. And this is where leaders can come in and exploit you by feeding you a version of the truth that frames you and your group as victims, which in turn gives them a ton of power over you.
All right, so now we're climbing into the top half of the ladder, and this is where the entire game changes. The focus shifts dramatically away from finding some external truth and moves toward creating real effective outcomes in the world. So that next rung up is the skeptic. A skeptic is smart enough to get out of that victim trap by just rejecting all the prepackaged stories, no matter who they're from. It's a defense mechanism, right? You don't just accept the approved answer. But while it keeps you out of harm's way, it doesn't necessarily produce any better results on its own.
And that leads us to maybe the most important level of the whole framework, the strategist. This is the person who stops obsessing over what's true and starts asking a totally different question. What works? Their whole focus is on systems, effectiveness, and results you can actually see, not on ideologies or arguing about who has the right facts.
I mean, this quote just says it all, doesn't it? I don't know what's true, but I do know what works. A strategist knows that if they build a solid system, instead of just daydreaming about a goal, or if they build a strong network, they're way more likely to get results. They're all about taking actions that have a high probability of success, no matter what the so-called truth is.
And then we get to the very top, level 6, the author. This is someone who seems to be playing a completely different game, like they're operating outside the rules. They don't just use systems, it looks like they're creating reality itself. To somebody on the outside looking in, it's like they're literally authoring the simulation we're all living in.
So, to make this idea, which is pretty out there, a little more real, the framework's creator offers some very specific and definitely controversial examples. He argues that people like Donald Trump, who he points out is often loose with the fact-checking, and Elon Musk, who just makes these seemingly impossible things happen, are operating at this author level.
Okay, so let's bring this all together. How does this actually explain those arguments where you feel like you're on different planets? Well, this example really gets to the core of it. A truther might come into a debate focused only on what they see as biological fact. End of story. But a strategist is having a totally different conversation. They're asking, okay, given that everyone disagrees, what's a practical system that actually works for society? You see, they're not even in the same conversational reality. And it's this kind of dynamic that's made this model so popular and so controversial online.
Okay, so that's the model in a nutshell. But just explaining it is only half the story. To really get it, you have to see how this idea is actually used out there in the wild. And that brings us to how this thing has taken on a life of its own as a wild internet meme.
Right, so that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because this isn't just some niche tool for personal development. In certain corners of the web, it's become something else entirely.
So what you see is that in certain online communities, places that are often adjacent to simulation theory or QAnon, this hierarchy gets used as a tool to rank people. It turns into a ladder of enlightenment or wokeness. And funny enough, the person posting it almost always sees themselves at the very top as a strategist or author, while brushing off anyone who disagrees with them as just a low-level truther or victim. It basically becomes a way to pathologize disagreement.
So where does that leave us? We've got these two totally different takes on the same idea. How are we supposed to think about this? What's the real takeaway here?
And really, the central conflict is this. On one hand, you have what could be a useful, if a little weird, mental filter for figuring out why communication breaks down. But on the other hand, you've got this self-congratulatory meme that people use to shut down arguments and feel superior. It's a tool, but it's also a trap.
So I'll leave you with this to chew on. Is this framework a genuinely useful map for understanding how people see the world differently? Or is it, in the end, just a more complicated, more sophisticated way to say, I'm right, you're wrong, and here's a handy chart to prove it? The answer, a lot like the model itself, probably has less to do with what's true and more to do with what you find useful.